Happy Monday, everyone. John Lorden here with another episode of Brain Scratch Case Cracked. Before we jump into today's case, I just want to remind you guys we've still got that promo running for CrimeCon standard badges. And on top of that, it looks like there will be a third true crime YouTuber at the Crime After Crime Meetup Drink Up event, and that is Stephanie Harlow. So if you want to come hang out with me, Danielle Hallen, and Stephanie Harlow, be sure to check the video in the description box below. Buy yourself a standard badge using the coupon code CrimeAfterCrime19. And if you're one of the first 10, we've still got some spaces left there. You will be invited to the Meetup Drink Up, and you get to hang out with now the three of us that are going to be there. So big thank you to Stephanie for joining the party and making it that much more fun. Really appreciate that. Today's case is called the Scarlet Letter. Not quite. It's called the Secret Letter, although, there might be some aspects of Scarlet Letter storytelling going on in this. And I want to give a very big thank you to Christy Arnhart for working so hard on this case. Let's get started. There are parts of the United States that are so remote they seem to be nothing but untamed wilderness. Iron River in Michigan is one of those places. Located in what is called the Upper Peninsula in the northernmost part of the United States, Iron River sits very close to the Canadian border. Houses are far apart, with hunting and fishing being a community pastime. With just over 3,000 residents, locals describe it as a good, remote place to start over, where no one knows you. 51-year-old Chris Regan was an ex-Air Force Master Sergeant, a disciplined man with 20 years of military experience and had recently moved to Iron River. A private person who loved the anonymity, he was making a good life for himself there. He dated a local school teacher named Terry O'Donnell. He got a job with the Oldenburg Group supplying engineering products. In a short time, Chris was promoted to a managerial position. But after only a year and a half in Iron River, Chris had grown tired of the Upper Peninsula and started to look elsewhere for work. This unfortunately ended his relationship with Terry, but the couple did keep in touch after their amicable breakup and still talked regularly. However, on October 14th, 2014, Chris stopped returning Terry's calls and text messages. As the days went by, Terry became more and more concerned for Chris's safety. For almost 2 weeks, his Hyundai Genesis had been sitting unattended at a local park-and-ride parking lot not far from her condo. Terry stated he would never have left his Genesis at the park-and-ride to begin with. That car was his child. He loved that car. With 2 weeks' worth of worry in her heart, Terry finally went to the Iron River Police Department to file a missing persons report with local sheriff Laura Frizzo. After a brief interview with Terry, Sheriff Frizzo immediately knew something was wrong. Terry explained that it had been 2 weeks since she talked to Chris and that he would not have lost touch so soon as he had just accepted a new job in North Carolina. Quickly, Sheriff Frizzo decided a trip to Chris's apartment was in order. Luckily, his landlord was Sergeant Cindy Barrett, who happened to be on duty that night. Upon entering Chris's apartment, they noticed that everything was in a state of complete disarray. Boxes were everywhere, some filled with moving materials, some empty. They also found to-do lists detailing Chris's next steps in his move. Terry insisted that Chris was a neat, meticulous person and would never have left his living space that cluttered. They decided their next step was to investigate his car at the park and ride. Because the car was locked, the women were only able to shine flashlights into the interior to investigate. Almost everything they could see through the windows were typical of Chris: an empty water bottle that he spit chew into, a pair of gloves, and a knee brace. It was the knee brace that chilled Terry. Chris had recently had knee surgery and had to wear the brace everywhere. He would have been unable to leave it in his car for 2 weeks. Even after the trunk was opened, nothing suspicious was found. It was as though he had just left and never came back. So where was Chris? As days went by, missing persons posters went up all over the community, but nothing was heard about Chris until Sheriff Frizzo received a call from Chris Regan, Jr. Chris's son was reporting his father missing as well. It had been 2 weeks since he had talked to him, and because he lived in another town, he didn't know anyone to call to check in on his father. His phone calls and text messages had also gone unanswered. As a child, Chris Jr. had been close to his dad, but over the years the two had become estranged. They were supposed to be moving in together, getting a chance for the two of them to work on their relationship. "I don't know what it is, but something is definitely going on," he told Sheriff Frizzo. By January of 2015, Chris Sr. had been missing for 3 months, and his son traveled to Iron River to put his father's possessions in storage. By this time, as investigators had been checking off leads, they came upon a prime suspect at his workplace. Apparently, Chris had been having an affair with one of his coworkers, a married woman named Kelly Cochran. 31-year-old Kelly shared workspace with Chris at the Oldenburg Group as an electrical assembler. When investigators initially interviewed Kelly and her husband, Jason, on October 27, 2014, they were struck by how aggravated Jason acted towards questioning. Kelly stated that her husband knew she had dated Chris Regan. She also stated that she hadn't talked to Chris in almost 2 weeks since October 14th. Life for Jason and Kelly Cochran started out as most couples would love to tell their tale. The pair had grown up next door to each other in Indiana and had been together as a couple for 15 years. After what her mother describes as a difficult childhood, where Kelly was put into a girls' home for a period of time, she seemed to flourish, and both Kelly and Jason attended Purdue University. After college, they started their own pool installation, repair, and cleaning service. Even with their business, Kelly was a take-charge person who ran the household. But after a few years, Jason developed back pain that prevented him from working. Not long after that, in February of 2014, the couple suddenly decided to move to Iron River, Michigan. With Jason now on disability, it was left up to Kelly to work outside the home and help provide income. Kelly was described as outgoing, smart, and quick to learn, so it didn't take her long to find a job. She ended up working for the Oldenburg Group. It was the military division that Kelly was hired into, and that's where she met Chris, and their relationship developed. Investigators invited Kelly and Jason to the station for informal questioning. Their interviews would only raise even more questions. She went on to state that she no longer worked at the Oldenburg Group, and since her dismissal, she and her husband had separated for a time due to his severe depression and chronic pain. Kelly had also spent time with another coworker named Eric Erickson. She said her husband knew about both other men, and he was fine with it. "Initially, we talked at work," Erickson said. "Then we exchanged numbers. It was text messages and sometimes phone calls." Erickson said that he had an issue with losing contact with her from time to time, making him feel as though there were other men she was seeing. She was fearful of living with Jason Cochran in the same house because he would become violent and enraged and would be physical with her, Erickson said. Jason went on to state that depression and anxiety from his injury were being treated by a psychiatrist, and that around the time of Chris's disappearance, Jason checked himself into a mental hospital. He claimed he was a danger to himself, and so he took proper steps and was released a short time later. He also said that he knew about his wife's affairs and tolerated them because he didn't want her to leave him. The text messages that investigators pulled from the couple's phones would tell a different story. In those texts, Jason was possessive and always suspicious of how Kelly spent her time, telling her to come home right after work and that he didn't want her seeing any men on her lunch break. Once the interview was done, investigators let the two go. By the 1st of March, investigators had enough probable cause to get a search warrant for the Cochran household. As the Cochrans sat in their next-door neighbors, the Saylor family's kitchen, investigators combed through the house that the couple claimed was being remodeled. Not only did they find an arsenal of knives and swords, but also a bat, a .22 pistol, and a shotgun were removed from the home, none of which were displayed as collector's items, but were seemingly stashed around the house in easy-to-reach places. It was the luminol that alerted investigators to the possible crime scene. On the ceiling were drops of cast-off blood. This type of blood stain is only created when blood is released or thrown from a blood-bearing object in motion, and the stain had been painted over recently. After 12 hours of searching, investigators had all the evidence they could find and released the house back for the Cochrans to come back to. Unbeknownst to the Cochrans, they then questioned the sailors. They told investigators that while they were searching the Cochran home, Jason was so scared he refused to speak, but Kelly had a lot to say. "What do you think they could find? Any hair, any blood?" she said in front of the neighbors. But it was the sailor's account of the last night anyone talked to Chris Regan that investigators found most interesting. That night, they heard a single gunshot followed by yelling and 2 cars starting and leaving. For many nights after that, and only during the middle of the night, power tools could be heard. Everyone knew the Cochrans were remodeling, but who remodeled in the middle of the night only? It was too early for forensics to complete their analysis, and with no prior records, the Cochrans were allowed to return to their home. By morning, they would be gone, having fled the Upper Peninsula. But they weren't aware that investigators had placed a GPS tracker to the bottom of the Cochrans' truck. Every step of the way, investigators knew exactly where they were going, and that they fled to their childhood home in Hobart, Indiana. Hobart police executed a warrant to bring Jason to the station to get a DNA sample. He told them he would give his DNA sample, but nothing else, and demanded to talk to a lawyer. Kelly was also brought in. She also said that she had no information, but she wanted to know what her husband had said. After asking for a lawyer, her sample was taken, and she was free to leave. Iron River investigators tried to get DNA results from the blood samples found in the home. They were shown to be human, but were too contaminated to get a solid DNA profile. Sheriff Frizzo decided to contact the FBI. Luckily, with a strong case building, and because it had now crossed state lines, the FBI were able to step in. They were able to obtain the GPS data on Chris's car, and found that he was indeed at the Cochran home the night he disappeared. They were also able to find under the front porch of the house Chris's lucky rabbit's foot that Terry O'Donnell insists he always carried with him. Still, this was not quite enough for charges to be filed. Amazingly, on February 20th, 2016, Hobart, Indiana dispatch received a 911 call from Kelly. Jason was vomiting, sweating, and barely breathing. When paramedics arrived, they could see that Jason had turned blue, and he was no longer breathing at all. As they tried to revive him, Kelly had to be removed from the scene. Paramedics state that she was constantly in the way, almost preventing them from helping Jason. 37-year-old Jason Cochran died from what they would find out to be a heroin overdose. The autopsy would show that there was something slightly different. There was petechial hemorrhaging around Jason's eyes, nose, and mouth, showing he had been suffocated as he overdosed. Investigators came up with a new approach and reached out to an online friend of Jason's. He agreed to call Kelly and tell her that Jason made a special request. If anything ever happened to Jason, he had been given a secret letter, and he was instructed to deliver that letter to the authorities. This friend told Kelly that he still had the letter, and he was sending it in. Kelly asked in a shaky whisper, "Please don't." Kelly knew her time was limited, and she went to the police station and made a confession. She told Hobart, Indiana detective Jeremy Ogden in a recorded interview on April 30th, 2016, that normal people share marriage vows, but she and Jason Cochran were different. They had agreed that if either one of them had an extramarital affair, the cheating spouse either would have to kill their lover or be killed by the other spouse. Jason Cochran had wanted his control and his wife back, she added, saying that she had stripped him of too much with her controlling ways. Cochran claimed she felt victimized by her husband, leading her to lure Regan to their Caspian home October 14th, 2014. She told investigators she and her husband had argued on October 13th, 2014, and that her husband asked her how she was going to fix things. In almost 70 hours of interviews, Kelly Cochran confessed that she lured Christopher Regan to her home with the offer of sex, and that her husband, Jason Cochran, interrupted them. Jason Cochran fired a long-barrel .22 caliber rifle past his wife into the back of Regan's head as he and Kelly walked up the stairs. Afterward, Kelly told investigators she got an extension cord for an electric saw so that Jason could dismember the body which was then placed in garbage bags and dumped in a wooded area off of Pentoga Trail in Crystal Falls Township 2 days after the killing. She agreed to take investigators to the spot that they dumped Chris's remains. After looking for several hours in the very wooded area, nothing was found. With no body, Kelly was still free. And before another meeting with investigators that she had previously agreed to, Kelly fled again. This time, there was no GPS unit to help find her. So Hobart investigators attempted to bait her using her own cell phone. They would periodically send text messages to Kelly's phone, knowing that eventually curiosity would get the better of her. Luckily, it paid off. 2 days later, she powered up the phone and investigators tracked her to Kentucky, where she was arrested and finally put into custody. She then started to open up even more and tell them an even more complete version of the events. During a May 23rd interview with Detective Ogden, Cochran said she blamed her husband for taking the only good thing I had in my life. I still hate him, Jason. And yes, it was revenge. I evened the score, she said. She also said that she was coerced and intimidated by her husband into luring Regan to their home. After Jason shot Regan, Kelly said her husband then dragged the body into the basement and directed her to get a reciprocating saw. She claimed he was angry with her and made her try to pull the bullet from Regan's skull with forceps. Although Jason considered placing Regan's head and hands in acid, he ultimately placed the body parts in about 15 plastic bags that they dumped off Pentoga Trail near the park and ride lot. Kelly told investigators she delivered an overdose of heroin to her husband on February 20th and put her hands on his neck, nose, and mouth. He died less than a minute later. It wasn't until mid-May 2016 that Kelly Cochran would finally direct Michigan investigators to a site where they found parts of the rifle used in Regan's killing and a skull with an apparent bullet wound in the back. Investigators also found a .22 caliber bullet and a pair of eyeglasses believed to belong to Chris. Kelly's brother, Colton Gaboyan, came forward saying he believed his sister is actually a serial killer with 9 additional victims to her name. He told investigators that she may have buried their bodies in Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, and Minnesota. However, the identities of the potential victims remains unknown to this very day. Kelly was convicted in May of 2017 for the murder of Chris Regan and given a life sentence. In May 2018, she made a plea deal with prosecutors and pled guilty to first-degree murder in her husband's death, being sentenced for an additional 65 years. Case cracked. Might be one of the longest scripts we've had for Case Cracked, but there was so much to go into with that story. And it's interesting because it seems like there's a couple of different things that cracked this case. Investigators putting the GPS tracker on the truck, just what a smart move, especially if you know that you're dealing with the person and they're likely to flee. I mean, just to have that tracker there really paid off for them. And then the whole aspect of the letter, this secret letter, getting one of her friends to contact her and mention, oh, he gave me a letter and told me to give this letter to the authorities if something would ever happen to him. Really just a very smart play, and obviously she played right into it. And then they kind of got her again with the text messages. They just, it's like they identified that within her character she had kind of impulse control issues, and they just used that time and time again to get her. On top of that, there was another aspect to this story. I wasn't sure if it was worth including, but I did just want to mention it in the comments here. The neighbors, the Saylor family, mentioned that after this noise in the night when this, supposed remodeling was going on, right after that had stopped, that the Cochrans actually invited them over for a barbecue, and they were very unsure of what the meat was and why there was so much of it there. There's a little bit of suspicion from them in particular that they might have been being fed parts of Chris, but I can't really find anything to back that up too much, but it does certainly seem to be a fear of theirs. So I did want to mention that as well. Of course, when they find the remains, if they're talking about finding a skull, and just the fact that we know that his body was moved in 15 different bags, it's a tricky recovery as it is, and I don't know that they could account for if that part of the story is really true or not. But that would be a horrible, horrible thing for a neighbor to do to another neighbor. And another point of interest is that that's the only time that the Cochrans ever invited those neighbors over for a meal. So a little bit strange. There's another weird kind of afternote on this case, and that is that Frizzo, that was working on the case, was fired at some point. She requested some time off. She was asked to provide a doctor's note. She did, and then she tried to come back to work, and they said, well, we need a doctor's note for you to come back to work. And then she provided one, and then essentially they fired her. Some strangeness, and there's some question if it has to do with her kind of not letting go of the other cases, the possibility that Kelly is indeed a serial killer and trying to tie some of these other cases and solve some of these other cases. There might be some type of political ruffle there. I'm really not certain, but there is a change.org petition. I am including it in the links below so you can check it out. If you're moved to sign it, please do so. And in another interesting side note, Frizzo and Ogden are dating. So we have the sheriff and the investigator that kind of both worked on this case at some point, eventually getting together. If you're interested in this case and you want to see more about it, check out the documentary called Dead North. And I believe you've got multiple episodes, and you can go through this in a much more detailed level than we touched on here today, despite the fact that I think we went pretty deep on this one. But what do you guys think? Let's talk about this case in the comments down below. And one other thing I just wanted to touch on about this whole secret letter aspect to it. It's just another lesson to keep in mind. There is nothing that prohibits law enforcement from lying about certain things in an investigation to get a desired result. And I think the secret letter aspect of this really kind of highlights that. What do you guys think? Let's talk about that. And I'll see you back here on Wednesday with a brand new episode of Searchlight on the Lord and Arts channel.